So we're preaching on Philippians for 4 weeks. This is the second week. And it's interesting because this is a letter that Paul wrote to the Philippians, and he wrote it while he was in prison, which, if I was sitting in prison writing, I might write a really lengthy letter, because, have nothing better to do. One of the really interesting things, it was kind of an aside that I kind of threw out, but it was something that I didn't know, I threw out last week when I preached, is that when they were sitting in prison, that they relied on people to bring them food, that when they were put in prison, they didn't eat unless people brought them food. And now, people have TVs and things in prison. And we rightfully complain that people are being treated too well, particularly if we look at the way that they were treated back then, that they actually didn't get food. And so Paul was in part writing a thank you letter to the Philippians, and he was handing the person from Philippi this letter and thanking him for bringing him sustenance, which was really nice. And one of the things that he refers back to is when he set up the church, when he was talking about setting up the church in Acts, and he was planning this. And now the church in Philippi has been in existence for 10 years, and now they're facing persecution. And of course they had all these great dreams and these wonderful plans. And now he's in prison and they're facing persecution. And he's in prison and he's like, I wonder if they're thinking, what did you get me into? Right? So they certainly need encouragement, right? The first one, just if I can kind of consolidate it, was to live as if God was in control. And sometimes, even now, we feel like God is not in control. We certainly act as if God is not in control. But He is in control, right? Right? And we want to be like the duck, like underwater, and they look crazy, like our feet are going like this, but on the surface we're like, I'm cool. We want to make sure that it looks like our theology is that God is in control.
Yes, amen.
And it doesn't look like our actions may look like that our life is totally chaotic, and people look at us and say, I don't want that. Right? So he wanted to make sure that people didn't look at the people of Philippi and say, I don't want that. That's not to say live a lie, but that you need to not look at the events. We had a lot of discussion about that. Paul did not look at the events, him sitting in prison. He wanted you to look at the eternity. Look at God's entire plan. To have confidence and trust God for the outcome. He wrote to his friends in Philippi and he said, what has happened will turn out for my deliverance. He understood that God is in control of the outcome, even if not the event. We like the idea that the Acts 1 church gathered together. We're going backwards a little. They gathered together and they had all things in common. Everyone loves that expression. They had all things in common. It was such a lovely idea. Do you remember, did anyone read the story of Stone Soup? I did a little bit of research on this story, Stone Soup, and it actually actually exists in many cultures. Raise your hand if you know the story of stone soup. No? So, stone soup, it goes back to like the 16th century. And stone soup is a story about, it's tweaked a little bit, but basically this kind of con artist comes to town and he's starving. And he says, I have a magic stone and I can make stone soup. This is magic stone that will make soup. And he said, all I need is a pot of water, and he puts the stone in the water, and he said, oh, do you have anything that you'd like to add to my magic soup? And someone says, well, I have some onion. And so they bring some onion to his magic soup, and someone else says, well, I have so-and-so. So basically, everyone from the whole town brings something to this soup. And basically then he takes his magic stone out and everyone in the community has a wonderful time eating this one. You guys have not heard stone soup. So that's the story of stone soup. And it's kind of like the Acts 1 church, which is a wonderful concept. And the Acts 1 church is a wonderful concept. They have all things in common. But all is not just stone soup. It's also all the yucky stuff. Right? So they also shared all the burdens. It's also, it's the kumbaya, someone singing Lord kumbaya. And even now, if we want that Acts church, it's also the good stuff and it's the bad stuff. It's, there are, I have a negative bank balance, kumbaya. There are metal detectors in my schools, kumbaya. Right? So we have to have an understanding that it's not all things in common. It's not just that we're sharing a wonderful pot of soup, that we're sharing all things. And that might have been a misconception in the Acts church. And Paul, sitting in prison, wants the people of Philippi to understand that when that persecution comes, that's a part of it. So when we get to chapter 2, he says, Jesus is a model for you, living in troubled times. And Jesus is this supernatural being, and yes, he's praiseworthy because they know what he went through, but what he wants them to see is that it's accessible. And they may look at Jesus and say, yeah, but he's the Son of God. I can't model myself after that. But he's challenging them to try to live up to that, to model themselves to that. And the first thing he tells them is, don't look out for number one. So that's like, he starts out with the hardest thing to do. Because it's human nature. It's like, I'm going to look out for number one. I got to take care of me. If we look at the first 4 verses of chapter 2, we're instructed that in the midst of the difficulties, not to look out for number one. And that runs counter, is certainly in this age, but it runs counter to everything we are taught. It's easy to be magnanimous when things are going well. It's easy for Oprah to say, you are. Right? That's a hard thing to do. But Paul laid out this challenge to people to take care of others before themselves, even when they were facing persecution. For example, consider this. This is the beginning of chapter 2. Therefore, and I had to read this over and over just to get, like, really, what is this really saying? Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, what he is just saying here is, if you care at all about Christ, if you have any connection, think about what he did for you. If that touches you at all, and you say, I can't believe what he did for me. If that touches you at all, if you have any mercy in your heart, if you feel like you are at all a part of our group and feel like, oh, Lord, you did that for me. If you have any feelings at all, like when a parent says to you, if you loved me at all, if you ever had fond feelings for me, you would do this. That's what he's saying. If he means anything to you. And then he says, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. So Paul is saying, you can make me so happy by trying to be like him. If you have any love for Christ, you can make me so happy just trying to be like him. And then he says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind. Here's the really hard one. Let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. This is Philippians 2, 3 to 4. He makes it sound like it's such a small thing. But wow, that is so hard. That is such a hard thing. Jesus was able to do supernatural things. Like when he was on the cross, he put others above himself. He even looked to the person next to him and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. That's putting others. He could have just said, Father, how about me? What are we going to do about me? Can you take care of me? Instead, he said, Father, forgive them. And what about this person next to him? He was talking to the person next to him. He was concerned about those around him. He was concerned about his mother and said, John, take care of him. Even before the cross, he was constantly reconciling people to the Father. And he said, I only do what the Father tells me to do. Healing, forgiveness, even turning water into wine. And Paul says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. What would an attitude like that be like in our everyday lives? And I know that's like a big ask, so I'm not going to take on everything that you could possibly do because it's too big. I just want to make one little suggestion. What if we just listened we just listened to other people? What if we just pretended that what other people were saying was more important than what we were saying? And I need to take this on myself. We've all heard the expression that we have 2 ears to hear and 1 mouth, so we should at least be listening twice as much as we're speaking. How many of us actually operate in that vein? I don't. I think mine is probably the reverse. I probably talk twice as much as I listen. What if every person I came up to, I behaved as if what they had to say was twice as important as what I had to say? I would be behaving as if I esteemed them more highly than I esteemed myself. That would be a radical concept that could probably change nations. Right? Your relationships would really be changed if you behaved like that. And daily, I know you come into contact with people. I have come into contact with people who hold you hostage in conversation. And there was a long time ago, but I'll never forget it. There's a person who would have a conversation and they would take a break by going, and then they would continue on, but they would keep that so that you couldn't break in conversation. And we all have little idiosyncrasies, and sometimes people do this, probably me. You're not listening to a person because you're actually thinking about the next thing that you're going to say, right? How about we all try to be better listeners? And let me say something about God. If you're evangelizing, if you're talking to people about God, you know what? God already knows you're saved. If you're talking to someone, you don't know where they stand, and you might not be giving them a chance to tell you where they stand. And you're saying, have you heard about Jesus? Do you go to church? Well, what do you think? Where do you go to church? Blah, 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 blah. What if you just shut up and say, tell me what you think about God? And then just shut up. And let them speak. Just listen. Just listen. Sometimes you don't leave enough air in the room for people to fill it. And it tells them that you think they're important enough for you to give them your time. Tell me what you think about whatever. Esteem people more than you esteem yourself. I know I'm driving that into the ground, but I think it will change things. So can y'all try to be better listeners this week and see if things change? Even with your kids. What if we just sat down and said, what happened today? Nothing? What kind of nothing? Right? In the next few verses, it goes from 5 to 11, we hear where Paul Paul writes a worship song. And when this letter got back, the believers in Philippi actually would sing this song. I'm going to read it to you, and then we're actually going to sing a little piece of it. I took part of it and I kind of wrote it into a little song. Here's what the whole song says. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant, and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's Philippians 2, 5 through 11. So this morning I was sitting there reading over the sermon. This was about 9:15 this morning. And I thought, yeah, you think they really sang this song? And so, because I'm a child of the 60s and 70s, the Queen anthem came, not the Queen, but the Queen, I don't know how to describe it.
Freddie Mercury.
Freddie Mercury, the Queen, came to me. And so I thought, I'm going to take this and put it to a little worship song. And so I need you all, this is your commercial break, so I need you all to stand up, and you're going to do the Queen anthem, We Will Be, you know that? It's stomp, stomp, clap, stomp, stomp, clap, stomp, stomp, clap. You know the song goes, we're not going to sing it. We will, we're not going to do that. Okay, it goes like this. You're going to repeat after me. Made himself of no reputation. Made himself of no reputation. Humble yourself. Whoa! Made himself of no reputation. Made himself of no reputation. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess Jesus Christ is Lord. I can't do it with a mic. He made himself of no reputation. Made himself of no reputation. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. You sing that with me. Let's do it again. Made himself of no reputation. Made himself of no reputation. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Sing it with me. Here we go. Every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. That's it. Thank you. All right. So now you have your little commercial break. You can have a seat. So this was the worship song that Paul wrote to the Philippians, and they actually sang this. The first of it talked about how Jesus made himself nothing, and that's why I used those three sections. That he made himself of no reputation, that he stepped down from heaven. Second, he humbled himself, allowing himself to be a sacrifice. And third, that God exalted him. During times of trouble, I think it's a human nature thing that we want to defend ourselves. Even when we're in an argument, of course, we want to defend ourselves. But I think it's important that as believers, we allow God to be our defender. That we should have humility of heart, like Jesus did. When Jesus was, well, there were many times, but particularly when he was being really dragged through the streets, and then when he was carrying the cross, and he was being shamed in so many ways, and people were yelling things at him. There were so many times when he could have defended himself, and yet he didn't. That he knew that God would ultimately be his defender. That he would be glorified by his Father. That he would be defended ultimately by the Father. And there's so many times when we feel like we have been wronged. And have you ever felt like when you're defending yourself, it only makes you feel petty? And yet your human nature is just like, but I. And yet, so many times it's so hard to fight that need to defend myself. And every time that I do, I feel like the Lord his victory is so much greater than mine would be. And I always end up feeling so petty and just kind of dirty and small. And I say, yeah, but rather than just let the Lord be my defender. There are 4 different times that the Bible says that God gives grace to the humble and resists the proud. And I think maybe that's why it makes me feel so small. When I defend myself, I think it's that pride that rises up in me when I feel like I have to defend myself. I think it's that pride. And then the grace goes away. And when you lose that grace, then you feel exposed. And I need that grace. I need that grace always. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you don't know who he is, it would be well worth just Google the name and read a Wikipedia piece on him or find a book on him. Very, very prominent pastor and writer during the time of Hitler, and he was a martyr. And he wrote, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. That if we are indeed called little Christians, little Christs, then Christ was called to come and die. And so in effect, if you take that logic path, if you are called to mirror Christ, Christ was called to come and die. And when we are called to be Christ, then we are called to die. And when you really think about that, that's a high calling. And when people come to an evangelistic campaign or something and they say, if you'd like to follow Christ, raise your hand. But if an evangelist is standing there, if you'd like to die, raise your hand. That's going to cut down on the hands that are raised. But in actuality, that is what you are saying. If you'd like to die, raise your hand. That's, wow. That's a whole lot more serious. And that's why I'm not an evangelist. But you are being asked to die to that person. And then the exaltation is the Father's work. You die. That's what Christ did. And then the Father, glorified the Son, said, look what my Son did. Look what my Son did. Look what my daughter did. Isn't that so much better? That you would die to that old Maureen and that the Father would say, oh my goodness. That requires so much faith, so much trust. Then Paul goes on to talk about working out our salvation. And some people kind of twist this a little bit, and they talk about the works salvation message, like works and saved by grace thing, and it's not at all the same thing. He says in 12 and 13, verses 12 and 13, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. And this is not in opposition to saved by grace. You are saved by grace through faith. In Ephesians it says that, right? And it's the same person that wrote this. We're saved by grace through faith. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. That's not meaning you have to go out and collect cans of food or whatever that works mentality is. It's not inconsistent. It is a gift. Your salvation is a gift. There was a pastor writer, Dallas Willard, who famously said, grace is not opposed to effort, it is opposed to earning. You can't earn the grace. We can fail to respond, though, to God's grace. It's like, I don't know how many of you do online shopping. Do you ever get these online little, like, come here, I want you to buy something. And it says, you have $100 in your cart. But you have to go buy something else first. That's like the grace of God. He says, you have this grace. It's in your heaven cart. You already have the grace. It's waiting for you, but you have to be obedient and come. The truth is that Jesus gave you a pass to heaven. But you have to go to the park. And he's trying to make you fit for heaven. You have to be obedient. Right? I talked a little bit about it, kind of in a jokey way, but it's such a great analogy. Remember, this is like worth writing down. Remember that your direction, not your intentions, determine your destination. Do you remember that? Your direction, not your intentions, determine your destination. So if my intention is to lose 20 pounds, and over here is a box of donuts, my intention is to lose 20 pounds. But my direction is constantly in that direction. I'm going to go in this direction, but my intention is to lose 20 pounds. But I'm going to go get a donut first. So my direction is here, but my intention and my destination is actually over here. direction to get a donut, right? Sin is like that. My intention is to live a godly life, but my direction is constantly going in this direction. Then where's my destination going to be? It's not where I actually intended it to go. And the last thing Paul talks about is to hold on. And this is really the last thing that these people needed to hear because their leader is in prison. And he says, do everything without grumbling or arguing. And I imagine when they got this letter, they probably said, how does he know we're grumbling and arguing? Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky, as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. You can tell that Paul was a pastor and a father to this community. He says, I will be able to boast. That's not to say I'm boastful or I'm proud. He's proud like, I would be so proud of you that you would carry on this work, that you would do these things, that you would shine like stars, that they would be blameless and pure. When he wrote this letter to comfort this community, he pointed to Jesus as their example. He wanted them to serve as Jesus served. And there were bigger needs there than just the obvious needs. Serve the widows and the orphans. There are people today, too, that need things other than just the obvious. It's not like Boy Scouts walking old ladies across the street. There are supernatural needs that Jesus fulfilled. I don't want you to think that it's just the obvious, be a servant, have the gift of service, which is great, and we should do all those things. Do whatever you are capable of doing. But there are times also when you have to step out and do the supernatural thing. You have to offer prayer. Betty in a cab has to step out there and sow seeds when she could just sit in the cab and keep her mouth shut. But you have to do the supernatural. You have to pray for people when you don't even know what their faith background is. You have to open your mouth, or you have to close your mouth when you really want to argue. You have to show and extend grace when you really don't want to extend grace. We need to be servants as Jesus was. And there are times that Jesus was a servant even when he was being supernatural. There are times when Jesus just wanted to hang and eat with his brothers. But he would instead do the supernatural. He would serve. A lot of us were raised by parents, and a lot of us are parents who would use the term, don't do as I do, do as I say. But Jesus was not that kind of friend, leader, pastor, teacher. He was always a model. And even when the end was in sight, He ate a lot of meals with these people when he sat with them. And he gathered together and ate Passover with them. But this time it was different. And he gathered them together. And once a month we gather together and we have a meal. Just like we model other things that he does, this is one of the things that we model that he did. I would like for us to come forward, and you can bring her forward if you'd like. But I'd like to come just up around the table here. And we would like to have communion together just as Jesus and his family did. Since it's such a small group, everybody just come up and stand around the table. So Father, we thank you that as your son sat around with his family, we thank you for the forgiveness that you offer us through his body, through his blood, and that he gathered those that he was closest with. That you gather your family here today, and that you offer forgiveness to us and your love. Thank you for your love in this community. And we do this in remembrance of what he did and who he is and your love for us. And we do this in remembrance of him. Take them. Thank you all for being here today. We bless you.